This is episode 131 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm pleased this week to be welcomed by not one, but two staffers at the great organization Americans for Tax Reform. First off, I am joined by Patrick Gleason, and we will talk to Paul Blair in a little bit in the next segment. But Patrick is with the State Affairs Office of Americans for Tax Reform. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
It's great to be with you, Paul, on your 131st episode.
Yeah, we've been at it for a little while now here. So
that's awesome.
Got a few under our belt, and we've had your boss, Grover Norquist, on the show at least once, maybe twice. And always happy to have folks from Americans for Tax Reform on. Before we get too far down into this interview, briefly describe Americans for Tax Reform, please.
Yeah, so we've been around for about 30 years. We were founded in 1985 at the request of President Ronald Reagan to help pass what became the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And we are still active today. We're active at both the federal and state levels. And I work with our state government affairs team. So I'm based in D.C., but I fortunately get to spend a large chunk of my time outside of D.C.
You got it. And folks can find out more about Americans for Tax Reform at atr.org. And specifically, we want to talk to you about a new report you came out with, the state of state governments, growing in some states, shrinking in others. And you are the lead author on this. But talk a little bit about this report. Is this the first edition you've put out of this report? And what did you have to go through to get this data and information? Because it's a great little report your organization did.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Paul. It's the first public edition of this report. We've compiled these numbers for a number of years. And what these numbers are it looks at the size of every state government, both where they stand today in comparison and how they've grown over the past 5 and 10 years. And when I say size of state government, I should define that. And that'll show you what the numbers we looked at are. And when I look at size of state government, we measured that as state spending as a percentage of state GDP. So the size of state government, the level of state spending as a percentage, as a share of the total state economy. And so we looked at that for all 50 states, and we looked at the numbers so we can see where they stand. Right now, we use 2017, the most recent data we had available for all 50 states, and that those numbers are compiled by the National Association of State Budget Officers, NASBO. And so we did that, and we compared that with state GDP numbers, which are provided by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so we compared every one. We have a 1 through 50 ranking. You can see the largest state governments to the smallest, where they stand today. And actually, unfortunate news for New Mexico, you're the second largest state government at 20.8% state spending is as a share of state GDP. And that's actually noteworthy because that's about double what it is for, if you look at all 50 states, state spending compared to all 50 state size of their economies. It's about, nationally, it's about 10%, just over 10%. State spending as a percentage of GDP. So if you look at that as kind of the national average for all 50 state total size of state government, New Mexico's size of government is double basically the national average. And so that's one bit of bad news there. And you look at the smallest state government, you have Texas. I know our friends in Texas will love to hear that they're the smallest state government, and they have where it is state spending is 6%, 6.7% of state GDP. So that's a big difference in size of state government from New Mexico at the second largest at 20.8% versus Texas at the bottom at 6.7%. And then, and Paul, I'm not trying to beat up on New Mexico. I'm just reporting the facts here. But not only does New Mexico fare poorly in where they stand today relative to other states being the second largest, only West Virginia has a larger state government relative to its state economy. But when we looked at how state government sizes have changed over the past 5 years, New Mexico has one of the fastest growing, actually the second fastest growing. So you have the second largest after West Virginia, and you've had also the second fastest growing. So it's grown 26.65% over the last 5 years. So those are some of the things we looked at. So we looked at where state stand today and kind of a snapshot, 1 through 50 ranking sizes of state governments, with West Virginia and New Mexico at the top being the largest, and Texas and New Hampshire at the bottom. And then we looked at the trends. So not only where they are today, but who's been rising the fastest and who's been shrinking the most. And actually, it's interesting. If you look back 5 years, it's exactly split. 25 states of the 50 have seen the size of their state governments grow, New Mexico being one of those, being one of the fastest growing ones. And the other 25 have seen some level of shrinkage. Now, mind you, state spending has gone up in all those states where the size of state government has shrunk. It's just that their economies have grown faster than their spending growth. Therefore, the size of their state government, looking at state spending as a percentage of GDP, that's gone down. So in summary, that's what we looked at. Those are kind of the basic numbers. And so it's just a metric, a way to look at and rank and compare the size of state governments, both where they stand today and also compare how they've been changing, who's been the fastest growing and the fastest shrinking.
Yeah, and a few things, kind of issues or questions I have about the report that are relevant. I saw this report because I get all your organization's emails and whatnot. And really, the size of government is what we're all about, shrinking the size of government, because you really don't have to look very far into this list to see that New Mexico's second biggest, Texas is the smallest. And that's one of the reasons why Texas is such a booming state economically. But on the other hand, you got state government. Now, is this state and local, or do you just stick to the overall state and talk about that kind of decision making? Because some states have a lot more local responsibility, some have more, statewide responsibility. But how did you work through that issue?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, because what we did is, so this does not include local spending. This includes state spending, but this also, so when I talk about state spending, I talk about 3 pots of state spending. There's the state general fund, there's other state funds, and then there's the federal transfer funds, which, these days is over about a third of total state spending in a lot of states. So yes, it is true, unfortunately, while a lot of state lawmakers look at those federal transfer funds as free dollars, they certainly are not. They're certainly paid for by, in New Mexicans and their federal taxes. And but that said, we felt like that was representative of the size of state government. And actually, that's a whole subject for another day. The growing share of state budgets that consist of are comprised of federal funds and the negative consequences that come with that. But so we include the federal transfer funds to the states, state general funds, and other state funds. We do not include local spending. So there is a case to be made, and there's a point to be made that for states where more of services are devolved to the local levels, this will not show up there. And so our friends at the John Locke Foundation, North Carolina, they've run similar numbers that incorporate local spending but don't include the federal transfer funds. So there's arguments to be made for including one or the other. I actually think, and this is something to look at for the next tranche of number running we do on this, but to throw in the local numbers. And that's something I'd like to do, because right now we are not capturing incorporating the places that might have devolved a lot of services to the local level, because we are just looking at state spending and state government. But that is something we would like to do as a next step when we look at these numbers, is also incorporate local spending.
Well, it's a great report as it is, but yeah, I mean, there's always more analysis, more efforts to be undertaken, and we're certainly trying to do our best to restrain the size of government in New Mexico. Now, the interesting thing, and I do want to talk about a few of the individual states because that'll provide a nice segue, but the 2012 to 2017 in New Mexico was an era with Governor Martinez, a Republican, in office. And quite frankly, if you talk to most New Mexicans, they'll say, yeah, government didn't grow very much during her time in office. So it's a little surprising. That's the most surprising thing in the whole report, that New Mexico grew second fastest. Now, we've seen a Democrat take over earlier this year, and she is truly blowing the doors off in terms of government spending, and just announcing government program after government program, grew the budget 11%. but most people would say the Martinez years were pretty fiscally restrained. Uh, any comments or thoughts on that? Is just the GDP didn't grow fast enough to make up for spending? What kind of thoughts do you have?
Yeah, I mean that number was surprising to me as well. I would need to dig deeper to look at what all accounted for this, and I think you guys would certainly be able to paint a better picture of what accounts for this. But I would just say this is kind of indicative of how failure to rein in spending. Well, I think that problem is worse in blue states and blue cities, and the numbers back that up. I mean, those are the numbers show that objectively. It's not limited to those states, and it's also a problem in states where Republicans are in charge, or in red states, in states where there's a Republican governor or a Republican-run legislature. There are certainly failures to rein in spending. So it's not limited to one side or the other. That said, I will say that the failure to rein in spending is more of a problem in blue states than it is in the red states we see. But there are unique individual cases here and there. So just having a Republican governor, is often this proves is not enough a lot of times to rein in the size of government. That said, we could be arguing against an unknown alternative. What would have been the case had there been a liberal Democrat in the governor's mansion who didn't want to cut the corporate tax, or didn't want to maybe serve as a hockey goalie stopping some bad ideas. So it's certainly not good to see New Mexico at the top of this list in terms of size of government where they are today, and also in terms of having been trending the highest. But there's some good examples in here of states that have done it right. In terms of some of the fastest shrinking, North Carolina. I was happy but not surprised to see North Carolina and Tennessee and some other states I expected to see amongst the fastest shrinking. Those are states that have been doing a good job at keeping spending in check, keeping it below the rate of population growth and inflation. North Carolina has done that for a number of years now. That's why they've had budget surpluses, billion-dollar budget surplus right now. At the same time, they've been significantly cutting income tax rates. So there was certainly some surprises in here, some expected results, but certainly some surprising results.
Yeah, and West Virginia was the fastest shrinking government of the past 5 years, which, if you kind of look at that trend of New Mexico being second already and growing the second fastest, with West Virginia shrinking the fastest in the country, that puts New Mexico on track to be number one with a bullet pretty soon in terms of the size of state government. I would love to sit and talk more and more about this information, because I think it's very revealing about the state of New Mexico and its political circumstances and challenges. But the number 29th state is actually our neighbor to the north in Colorado. And while it's a purplish state and trending blue, it seems, they have some constitutional protections that really do a lot to constrain the size of government in the state of Colorado. But those are under attack this fall. And I know we're a New Mexico-based podcast, but when you look at success stories, not just in this region, but across the entire country, Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights is the gold standard, as we see it, I think, of limited government. So talk about what's going on with the Taxpayers Bill of Rights and what people in New Mexico need to know about this.
Yeah, Paul, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is a story, I think, of national interest, and it's something that's going to play out here before the end of the year. So Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that is really, as you mentioned, kind of the gold standard for taxpayer safeguards. That has really been the thing that has prevented Colorado from going the way of California in terms of tax rates and overregulation, because that state government in Colorado right now has a very, very far left progressive governor and far left progressive legislative leadership in both chambers. Despite that, they are not able to institute the income tax hikes and other tax hikes they would like to impose because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And so I'll explain that a little bit for your listeners. Here's what it does. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights was approved by voters in 1992 in Colorado, and it does two things. It caps the rate of state spending growth at the rate of population growth plus inflation. So if state spending grows in excess of that rate, that money is refunded to taxpayers. In addition to that spending cap, it requires that all state tax increases must be approved by a vote of the people. And so this has really been the thing that has protected Colorado taxpayers in recent years, as they've seen their state government being taken over by big government, left-wing, bolder Democrats, they have not been able to carry out their wishes. And that's been a good thing. Well, knowing that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is the obstacle to everything on the progressive wish list, Democrats in Colorado have mobilized to kill Tabor. They've been trying to kill it for years. And this year, they'll have a measure on the November ballot of this year, 2019. So in 2 months, Proposition CC, and this would effectively gut Tabor. It would basically end Tabor's spending cap, and it would end by ending all refunds. So whenever revenue would come in above the rate of population growth plus inflation, if Proposition CC passes, instead of going back to taxpayers, that money will stay with state government and grow the size of state government. And this is important because Colorado taxpayers are due a refund in accordance with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights next year, thanks to a strong economy boosted by the federal tax reform and regulatory reform in recent years. Revenue collections in Colorado have been robust. They're more than half $500 million in excess of the Tabor rate. So that money is scheduled to be refunded to Colorado taxpayers next year. So Proposition CC, if approved by Colorado voters this year, would stop that refund from taking place next year and would also stop all further refunds in perpetuity. So it effectively would end the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It would mean a higher tax burden for Colorado taxpayers in the future, and it would mean a gutting and effectively the death of the strongest taxpayer safeguard in the nation. So something to keep an eye on too. And also, we're hopeful that Colorado voters will reject Proposition CC, and if they do, and we're hopeful that they will, if they do, you would have voters who just blue state battleground voters who just elected a Democrat-controlled state government. You would have them affirming and upholding the Taxpayer Bill of Rights and saying, hands off, we like this. So that would be a noteworthy message, I think, from a battleground state, purple state electorate that we could get this November. And it might want to give some 2020 Dem presidential hopefuls some pause about their high tax and spending policies if you have blue-purple state Colorado voters upholding the Taxpayer Bill of Rights this fall. So it's Proposition CC, and it's going to be on the November ballot. So it's important in Colorado, but I believe it's of national significance. And as such, I'll have an op-ed later this week in foxnews.com on this ballot measure and why everyone around the country should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, I don't think there's even possibly a more important state-level voter initiative or referendum to be voted on this fall, because that is such a critical and such an ideal way to limit the size of government. And it's obviously Colorado has definitely moved to the left. They voted on raiding the Tabor and not having the rebates in some respects before, but this would really completely eliminate its existence. So it's a huge vote.
They had actually one thing to add to that, Paul, that you mentioned they had the suspension of Tabor. They did. That was referendum C in 2005.
Right.
I will note the Republican governor at the time, Bill Owen, who was a supporter of that suspension. He is now with us in opposition to Prop CC. So even a past supporter of the Tabor Taxpayer Bill of Rights suspension has now come out and said we cannot pass Proposition CC. We cannot kill Tabor. So just something to note there.
Yeah, and the difference between Colorado and New Mexico is quite stark economically. They're one of the wealthiest, most prosperous states. We're among the poorest states. Although we'll see, it might change, and that brings us to the third thing that we wanted to talk about is what's driving New Mexico's economy is oil production, and states, though, are looking to levy carbon taxes, federal proposals, state proposals. So talk a little bit about the threat of carbon taxation and what that means for one of America's top energy producing states right here in the land of enchantment.
Yeah, so we've had pretty much all the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates have come out in support of a carbon tax. And we have folks in Congress in Washington pushing for a carbon tax. We have a lot of well-funded lobbying organizations pushing for a carbon tax, a national carbon tax. So this is a real threat. Lawmakers at the federal government and those who want to be president would like to impose a carbon tax that would raise utility bills, raise gas prices, raise overall cost of energy, and just cost of living. Well, while they're trying to do this at the national level, carbon tax proponents have been failing left and right in blue states and blue cities where you would think the politicians and the electorates would be most inclined to support things like carbon taxes. There's been some major setbacks for carbon tax supporters. So while they keep talking about the need for a national carbon tax on the Democrat debate stage or in op-ed pages, we just saw recently, actually going back to Colorado, in Denver, the Denver City Council, run by very far left-wing politicians, even though they had a carbon tax bill that the majority of the city council had supported and endorsed just shortly before they were scheduled to vote on it last month in August. They pulled the bill, and the Democratic mayor, had talked them off the ledge and urged them not to pass this local carbon tax, explaining the damage it would do to the local economy in Denver. And just before that, just before August, you had Massachusetts legislators. They have a Republican governor, but they have a very far left-wing Democratic-run state legislature, and they've got a carbon tax bill pending in that state legislature that would do a state carbon tax in Massachusetts. And like actually the proposal in Denver that had support from the majority of the Denver City Council, the bill in Massachusetts is sponsored by the majority of the Democratic-controlled state legislature. Despite that, they have not deemed fit to pass that state-level carbon tax in Massachusetts. And why is that? I believe it's because they recognize, even though they like to pay lip service to this, they recognize the harm it would do to the local economy in Massachusetts. And so I would suggest probably that's why they haven't wanted to go forward and lead on that. Massachusetts Fiscal Alliance, they put out a great study in conjunction with the Beacon Hill Institute that looked at how many jobs state carbon tax would cost the Massachusetts economy, how much it would raise taxes. They found it would be a $755 tax hike in 2022, rising to a little over $1,200 in 2026. And so that's just Massachusetts. And that comes after we've had two consecutive rejections at the Washington state ballot, another blue state, of a carbon tax there in 2016 and 2018. So, while we are seeing ramped up rhetoric and push for a carbon tax nationally, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's Democrats running for president, the fact is, even left-wing blue political jurisdictions are, even though they've introduced carbon tax proposals and debated them, have not seen fit to enact them themselves. So most recent activity again on that is Massachusetts and Denver. Oh, also Maine. Maine, that's another Democrat-controlled state, has carbon tax legislation. They had a hearing on it earlier this year. Overwhelming grassroots opposition came out and testified against it. And in response to that, the sponsor there, the Democratic sponsor, pulled the bill. So, even in the states where if all Democrats got together because they're in charge, they could pass whatever they want, they are not seeing fit to pass carbon taxes. So I think that's noteworthy. And if anybody wants more information on how you can find out how carbon taxes have been a political loser, in addition to being just bad public policy, how they've been a political loser, not just domestically here in the U.S. and states and cities, but also abroad in countries like Canada, Australia, and France. If you go to atr.org and you / carbon tax timeline in the search bar, you'll get that timeline that walks you through the many examples. So we'll see. There might be also some repercussions at the ballot box in Canada next month for Trudeau and others, some backlash to their support for a carbon tax there. So I would encourage folks to check that out.
All right. Thank you, Patrick, and appreciate your time. I now welcome Paul Blair to the show, also with Americans for Tax Reform. And Paul is the State Affairs Director at that organization. Paul, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to talk about totally different issues from what we talked with Patrick about. In fact, an issue that at the outset may not be connected in some ways to the issue of taxation and limited government, but vaping. Paul, why is vaping a limited government issue that you taken an interest in?
Sure. So this has been a really cool issue for us over the last couple of years. We first got involved when states looked at changing the definition of what exactly a tobacco product was. As you know, tobacco products are heavily taxed. They are often a top target for regulations and bans and restrictions. Lawmakers love to extract as much money as possible out of smokers. And so when e-cigarettes and vapor products began to enter the market after 2009, a couple of states began to look at and try to redefine what a tobacco product was to include products that didn't necessarily contain tobacco, but that were being used to deliver nicotine to the adults that bought them and used them, and as we've seen, used them successfully to quit smoking. And so kind of ATR's origin story here is that between 2013 and 2017, what we saw at the state level is that the number one target for tax hikes of any product, of any industry across the country was e-cigarettes. More so than tobacco, more so than liquor, more so than any of the other sort of sins that folks like that legislators like to make a lot of money on. And so our approach to this at the state level over the last couple of years has been having conversations about the science behind the use of these products, the effectiveness on the use of these products for smokers that have transitioned away from combustible cigarettes, which result in the premature death of 480,000 people a year, onto e-cigarettes, which are 95 to 99% less harmful than cigarettes, but also looking at this from the context of what that might mean for state budgets. In terms of Medicaid, smokers have a disproportionate impact on public health care costs in terms of what states spend on health care, including Medicaid. And so one of the things that we've looked at from a taxpayer perspective is if you transition smokers that are disproportionately low income and rely on programs like Medicaid for health care onto alternatives that can be more than 95% less harmful over the long term, you're going to see significant taxpayer savings. And so that's kind of the lens that we viewed this at as it relates to being a taxpayer issue. But what we found as we've engaged on these state tax fights, including in New Mexico, is that there's a political component to this as well. And so while if you look at it from a limited government perspective, it's just absurd for the government to come in and tell people that are using these products that they either shouldn't use them as replacements for cigarettes or that they should be treated the same as cigarettes is absurd. There is no justification for that sort of policy treatment of these people. And again, to the politics of it, they feel very deeply passionate about these issues and for good reason.
Got it. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but before we kind of attack some of those issues, including the taxation now in New Mexico, can you describe what exactly vaping is? Because I'm sure a lot of people who maybe for them podcasting is pretty high tech and fancy. To them, vaping seems like something from another planet. What the heck is vaping when it comes down to it?
Absolutely. And it's a good question in the context of a lot of the national news stories that we are seeing right now. And I think there's a lot of confusion about the sort of vaping that limited government advocates should celebrate, and then the sort of vaping that the Department of Justice and drug enforcement agencies and states that have, legalized marijuana are talking about. And so when I'm talking about vaping, and when we talk about vaping in the context of transitioning cigarette users onto e-cigarettes, the technology is pretty simple. And it is essentially in many of the products that exist, they vary in terms of what you can get at a vape shop or a convenience store. But essentially what it is a battery that heats an aerosolized liquid. So the basic components of the liquid are propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, in many cases nicotine, and then in some cases flavors, in a way that delivers nicotine because it lacks combustion. You're not lighting anything on fire. Unlike a cigarette, which you need a match or a lighter to heat up, you're delivering nicotine by vaping it without the sort of combustion that results in all of the carcinogens and the tar and long-term the cancer associated with combustible tobacco use. And so when it comes to nicotine, you're heating a liquid at a much lower temperature in a way in which even the FDA has acknowledged by eliminating that combustion, you're doing so in a way that reduces the harm associated with the product's use. Former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, even the director of the Center for Tobacco Products, Mitch Zeller, all acknowledge, and funny enough, Donald Trump, for the first time this past Friday, acknowledge that vaping as an alternative to cigarettes is a good choice. But there are a lot of products on the market. In fact, I think the last time that I looked at the registration with the Food and Drug Administration, there are more than 2.5 million different products on the market in the U.S. in terms of different flavors, in terms of different nicotine levels. And it's important that there are that many different products in the market, because what we've seen in recent years is that for a smoker to switch to an e-cigarette, whether it's the sort of product that you buy in the store or the sort of bigger devices that allow you to customize the sort of liquids that you add to these devices, you need a unique experience for the consumer, because a 2-pack-a-day smoker with a particular brand, say Marlboro, might like a different flavored tobacco or a flavored cherry or a flavored desserts, actually among the more popular nationwide product, because it tastes better. And that's a part of the appealing effect for adult smokers. And so there are a lot of products on the market. But if you go into a convenience store, you may only see 7 or 8 different products. There are products like Juul that is a company that gets a lot of attention. But that's not the only product out there. There are, like I said, 2.5 million on the market. So they come in all different sizes and shapes, which I think is a good thing, because there are so many different types of smokers, not only in terms of the brands that smokers use, but the intensity of which they use cigarettes. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that the diversity of this market, the number of products that are on the market, has been extremely helpful in driving down cigarette use, because that unique customizable experience that adults are looking for is an appealing component to that transition between, again, cigarettes to e-cigarettes.
Now, before we get to what's going on in Washington, D.C., you mentioned New Mexico is one of the states that just levied a tax on vaping products. Now, tobacco taxes have always been in place in most states, but they've risen dramatically across the country. And you could at least make a plausible case that, well, there's a lot of harmful outcomes health-wise. Some of that's picked up by the taxpayers, and you could debate whether the early death associated with tobacco actually reduces taxpayer expense or not, et cetera. But why do you think states are getting into taxing vaping at a pretty heavy rate right now? Is there a health issue? Is it some just, we like revenue, we're going to get money wherever we can get it? What are you seeing across the country on this issue?
What's been interesting about the evolution of stated or admitted reasons behind taxing e-cigarettes is that it has evolved and changed over the years. There's not a lot of money out of taxing e-cigarettes, because it is a much smaller percentage of people that use it when compared to cigarettes. And so New Mexico, for example, has 2 different taxes on the different types of products that you can buy. And so if you go into a convenience store and you purchase a Views or a Juul, two popular products, it's a 50-cent per product tax that's on the products. And then if you go and buy some product that's at a vape shop, for example, with those bottles of liquid that people put into the devices that they use, it's 12.5% wholesale. And so there are even different tax models within the tax scenarios that have played out across the country. But getting money, if that's the objective of lawmakers, it's a bad industry to go after, because, again, it's still somewhat small when compared to the overall tobacco market. What we've seen over the last 12 months is people who refuse to acknowledge the growing global scientific consensus that these products are so far less hazardous to an adult consumer who uses cigarettes' health. And what they've said is that, well, we have a lot of fake news and fake science. What they've said is that, well, these are products that are dangerous and people shouldn't use them, and so we have to make them more expensive. Not necessarily to make money, but because we just have to discourage consumer use. It's an absurd argument because when you look at the populations that are most at risk for cigarette use, it is low income folks. It is folks who every penny that some dumb government policy imposes in the form of higher costs as a disincentive for switching is extremely regressive and extremely harmful. But largely the stated reason is that we've just got to discourage people from using these products, which for adults that smoke is a laughable assertion. Right.
Now, you mentioned the variety of products out there. And of course, there's some very well documented, or at least highly publicized, I should say, cases where people have had bad health reactions to some of these things. And this has spurred action by the Trump administration, or at least threats. Anyway, it's a fast changing environment. So can you shed some light on what the situation is like in Washington on this issue, and what kind of products and what kind of issues are developing with some of these things?
Sure. So in the last couple of weeks, there have been a lot of national news stories about, I think, 7 or 8 individuals who have died as a result of vaping. There have been something like 350 to 380 individuals who have reported some sort of lung illness or respiratory issue as a result of vaping. What is important to understand is that as more information comes out about what those people were vaping, in most cases, all of the data and evidence that we have right now is that they were vaping THC, marijuana, oils that they largely purchased or acquired on the black market. And so this is one of these problems with prohibition. Without necessarily taking a stance on marijuana, what we're seeing in the United States is that hundreds of thousands of these products are being shipped out of Southern California, all over the country. People are buying and getting marijuana from their friends and on the black market, as they have for years, and inhaling those products through vaporizers that they purchase to use marijuana has had negative health outcomes. And so the problem is that the negative health effects associated with using marijuana oils and THC and black market products produced by drug dealers in California is a totally different issue than the commercial flavored nicotine market of products that are available in convenience stores for smokers. And I think that's one of the problems in DC is that the people like Matt Myers at the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and Mike Bloomberg, who doesn't want anyone to celebrate any sort of freedom in the country, who are spending $160 million to destroy this industry, would like to conflate the issues because their stated objective is banning e-cigarettes. And so unfortunately, we have some voices and pressure within the administration, including Mrs. Trump, who have expressed concern about youth using these products. And look, kids should not use e-cigarettes, whether it's marijuana or contains nicotine. They're not designed for them. That's why we have legal age to purchase limits that prohibit the sale of these products to minors. But because we have a few people across the United States that are getting sick from vaping marijuana does not mean that we should limit adult access to flavored products intended for adult smokers. And so President Trump last Wednesday announced that the administration was looking at a ban on all flavored e-cigarettes in the country. 2 days later, on Friday evening, he tweeted that he likes vaping as an alternative to cigarettes, and we just have to make sure we have products that are safe for everyone, which is kind of an interesting evolution and kind of endorsement of tobacco harm reduction. But the fight that we are currently engaged in right now is that Secretary Alex Azar does not have a sensible approach to the regulation of this industry. Acting Commissioner Ned Sharpless, who, by the way, is a Democrat, does not have a sensible approach. And if he does, he hasn't stated it publicly. And we have a regulatory system for millions of products on the market that is designed to end in failure. And so the administration is currently looking at rules that would take 90+% of all of the products off the market, which would immediately result in an increase in smoking rates. And so if the Trump administration wants their legacy to be that they caused more people to smoke cigarettes, they absolutely should move forward on this. But to my earlier point about the politics of this, the argument we've been making, and one that I think should resonate, is that vapor voters are very passionate and they're single issue oriented in terms of their belief and understanding that the government that wants to limit the products that they use is a government that wants them to return to smoking and wants them to die. And that might sound kind of crazy for people that don't smoke or have never met someone that has quit smoking with e-cigarettes. But the number of adult vapors who have transitioned away from cigarettes to products that are demonstrably less harmful far outweighs the number of that may determine the outcome of the election in 2020 as a result of this issue. And so it is a powerful political issue. When you look at states like Michigan, where Trump only won by 11,000 votes in 2016, by our estimates, there are more than 422,000 adults that use e-cigarettes in that state. And polling that we did in 2016 showed that 4 out of 5 of these adult consumers are single issue voters on where a politician stands on whether they should be taxed out of existence or prohibited altogether. And so it's a losing political issue as well. We'll see what the Trump administration does in the coming days and weeks, but right now I don't have a lot of optimism.
So we've talked about individual freedom. We've talked about political coalitions. We've talked about taxes, and that's either taxes imposed by the states or tax dollars saved from sick people who smoke cigarettes and the alternatives to that. Another hot button issue for a lot of kind of pro-liberty, limited government folks involves the FDA and kind of the regulatory apparatus. Why don't we have a better grasp on whether vaping, how safe it is relative to cigarettes, I guess, would be the way to phrase it, because it seems like there's a lot of studies out there, but mostly in Great Britain and other foreign countries. Where is the U.S.? If it's the FDA, if it's not the FDA, tell me who is supposed to be doing these kinds of studies and why we don't have firm, U.S. American evidence for what's best for American consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the American public health apparatus is committing medical malpractice in misleading adults about the risk of products on the market. And it is unfortunate because on health issues globally, the United States is generally a leader. Now, this predates the Trump administration. Obama put in motion the regulations that would have put this entire industry out of business. It's not like Trump is creating a scenario that did not necessarily exist before him. But we've got the Royal College of Physicians, Public Health England. These are where I get the studies that suggest the products are 95 to 99% less harmful than cigarettes. And it's unfortunate because we do have an acknowledgement from the FDA and the head of the Center for Tobacco Products that the adults that switch to these products will experience improved health outcomes. But we're in a situation where the CDC refuses to even acknowledge the point that I've made about the harms that people are currently experiencing from vaping as a direct result of THC cartridges that they're purchasing on the street. The FDA will admit that, but the CDC won't. So we have a debate within this administration as to how much information we should or should not give to people. And then we have the CDC suggesting no one vape. So the CDC's current recommendation to 34 million American adults smokers is don't even try with products that our own government admits is less harmful than cigarettes. So it is malpractice. It's again long been the goal of the anti-tobacco activist community to ban every product that every tobacco company sells. I think where they're in this interesting situation right now is that they're now not fighting against one or two tobacco companies. They're fighting against tens of thousands of small businesses run by people who quit smoking cigarettes, sold by those tobacco companies with far less harmful alternatives. And so I don't know what the answer is on why we are being misled by the government about the relative risk of these products. But I think what we've seen in recent years is that public perception about the relative risk of these products has changed in a way in which people are misled into believing that cigarettes and e-cigarettes are on the same level. And it's absurd because it's, my background is not necessarily in science, but it doesn't take a scientist to understand that when you remove combustion from the equation, that a product becomes less harmful. And the FDA agrees with that. They've approved products where combustion isn't involved. including a heat not burn tobacco product that you essentially vape. So they're allowing tobacco products that you vape, but not non-tobacco products. And so I can't necessarily explain why, other than to suggest that there is a lot of money being spent, again, by the Mike Bloombergs of the world, to demonize this industry in a way in which they have convinced the administration that suburban moms are so concerned about their kids vaping that the only solution is to ban every product on the market. Again, these are the same people that think you shouldn't have Second Amendment rights, who don't think that you should be able to get extra large big gulps. These are not necessarily pro free market, freedom oriented people, but they have a lot of money. And so I don't know how we change that equation. I've been working on this issue from the perspective of demonstrating the health impacts and trying to get folks to acknowledge the science behind this. But it seems that it's now a political fight. And again, my point has been to the administration, if you want to lose the 2020 election, move forward on this stuff. And in New Mexico alone, I mean, you have a little over 1.61 million adults in New Mexico. And by the FDA's estimate, that means you've got about 80,000 adult vapors in the state. That's CDC data on 2017 use. Hillary Clinton only won New Mexico by 65,000 votes. And so while you've got Trump campaigning in your state in hopes of turning it into a more competitive state than it actually is, the margin of victory for Hillary Clinton is smaller than the number of adult vapors who Donald Trump is currently considering limiting their access to products that they will rightly attribute to saving their lives. So that's a long way of saying I don't know why in the world they're screwing this up, but screwing it up is the best way to describe what they're doing.
Now, we only have a minute or so left. So real quickly, what gives the federal government the power to even do this? Say if they ban all of these products, where does that authority come from? Will we have black market vaping going on? Kind of real quick, try to explain that situation.
Sure. So 2009, Congress gave the FDA the authority to regulate the tobacco industry, and Obama administration interpreted that to also mean products that might contain nicotine with something called the deeming rule in 2016. And the FDA can just say, they've got the discretion to say that you're not allowed to remain on the market anymore until, because Congress gave us permission to regulate this industry, you get permission from the government to keep your products on the market. So there is some gray area on a legal regulatory ground, but the Congress did give them the ability to regulate the entire tobacco industry in 2009.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul Blair of Americans for Tax Reform. ATR.org is where you find out more about Paul and Patrick's work. Thanks for your time today, and thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.